Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from chapter 325. Chapter 325. As generally happens, Pierre did not feel the full effects of the physical privation and strain he had suffered as a prisoner until after they were over. After his liberation, he reached Orel, and on the third day there, when preparing to go to Kiev, he fell ill and was laid up for 3 months. He had what the doctors termed bilious fever. But despite the fact that the doctors treated him, bled him, gave him medicines to drink, he recovered. Scarcely any impression was left on Pierre's mind by all that had happened to him from the time of his rescue till his illness. He remembered only the dull gray weather, now rainy and now snowy, internal physical distress, and the pains in his feet and his side. He remembered a general impression of the misfortunes and sufferings of people, and of being worried by the curiosity of the officers and generals who questioned him. He also remembered his difficulty in procuring a conveyance and horses, and above all, he remembered his incapacity to think and feel all that time. On the day of his rescue, he had seen the body of Petya Rostov. That same day, he had learned that Prince Andrew, after surviving the Battle of Borodino for more than a month, had recently died in the Rostovs' house at Yaroslav, and Denisov, who told him this news, also mentioned Helene's death, supposing that Pierre had heard it long before. All this, at the time, seemed merely strange to Pierre. He felt he could not grasp its significance. Just then, he was only anxious to get away as quickly as possible from places where people were killing one another, to some peaceful refuge, where he could recover himself, rest, and think over all the strange new facts he had learned. But on reaching Orel, he immediately fell ill. When he came to himself after his illness, he saw in attendance on him 2 of his servants, Trenti and Vaska, who had come from Moscow, and also his cousin, the eldest princess, who had been living on his estate at Elets, and hearing of his rescue and illness, had come to look after him. It was only gradually during his convalescence that Pierre lost the impressions he had become accustomed to during the last few months, and got used to the idea that no one would oblige him to go anywhere tomorrow, and that no one would deprive him of his warm bed, and that he would be sure to get his dinner, tea, and supper. But for a long time in his dreams, he still saw himself in the conditions of captivity. In the same way, little by little, he came to understand the news he had been told after his rescue, about the death of Prince Andrew, the death of his wife, and the destruction of the French. A joyous feeling of freedom, that complete and alienable freedom natural to man, which he had first experienced at the first halt outside Moscow, filled Pierre's soul during his convalescence. He was surprised to find that this inner freedom, which was independent of external conditions, now had, as it were, an additional setting of external liberty. He was alone in a strange town, without acquaintances. No one demanded anything of him, or sent him anywhere. He had all he wanted. The thought of his wife, which had been a continual torment to him, was no longer there, since she was no more. "Oh, how good, how splendid," said he to himself when a cleanly laid table was moved up to him with a savory beef tea, or when he lay down for the night on a soft, clean bed, or when he remembered that the French had gone and that his wife was no more. "Oh, how good, how splendid." And by old habit he asked himself the question, well, and what then? What am I going to do? And he immediately gave himself the answer. Well, I shall live. Ah, how splendid. The very question that had formerly tormented him, the thing he had continually sought to find, the aim of his life, no longer existed for him now. That search for the aim of life had not merely disappeared temporarily. He felt that it no longer existed for him and could not present itself again. And this very absence of an aim gave him the complete, joyous sense of freedom which constituted this happiness at the time. He could not see an aim, for he now had faith. Not faith in any kind of rule or words or ideas, but faith in an ever-living, ever-manifest God. Formerly, he had sought him in aims he set for himself. That search for an aim had been simply a search for God. And suddenly, in his captivity, he had learned not by words or reasoning, but by direct feeling, what this nurse had told him long ago, that God is here and everywhere. In his captivity, he had learned that in Karatsiev God was greater, more infinite, and unfathomable than the architect of the universe recognized by the Freemasons. He felt like a man who, after straining his eyes to see into the far distance, finds what he sought at his very feet. All his life he had looked over the heads of the men around him, when he should have merely looked in front of him, without straining his eyes. In the past, he had never been able to find that great inscrutable infinite something. He had only felt that it must exist somewhere and had to look for it. In everything near and comprehensible, he had seen only what was limited, petty, commonplace, and senseless. He had equipped himself with a mental telescope and looked out into remote space, where petty worldliness hiding itself in misty distance had seemed to him great and infinite, merely because it was not clearly seen. And such had European life, politics, Freemasonry, philosophy, and philanthropy seemed to him. But even then, at moments of weakness, as he had accounted them, his mind had penetrated to those distances, and he had there seen the same pettiness, worldliness, and senselessness. Now, however, he had learned to see the great, eternal, and infinite in everything, and therefore, to see it and enjoy in its contemplation, he naturally threw away the telescope through which he had till now gazed over men's heads, and gladly regarded the ever-changing, eternally great, unfathomable, and infinite life around him. And the closer he looked, the more tranquil and happy he became. That dreadful question, what for, which had formerly destroyed all his mental edifices, no longer existed for him. To that question, what for, a simple answer was now always ready in his soul. Because there is a God, that God without whose will not one hair falls from a man's head. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 325 of War and Peace. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 325, The Last of the Human Freedoms. On October 19, 1944, Viktor Frankl, at the age of 38, entered the Auschwitz concentration camp as a prisoner of the Nazi state. Over the course of the next year, he worked at various other camps as either a physician or a slave laborer. His family wasn't so lucky. Only his sister survived. Upon gaining his freedom, Frankl set to work chronicling his experiences in the concentration camps. The project was, in part, his attempt to answer the perennial question of how an individual can find meaning in a world filled with such grievous and constant suffering. Part of the answer to this question, published in his book Man's Search for Meaning, is that, quote, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms. To choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. End quote. Pierre Bezukhov is, in a way, Frankl's fictional near analog. Pierre, too, suffers great loss and sorrow at the hands of a Western European tyrant with ambitions of global domination. Pierre, too, endures imprisonment and privation. And, like Frankl, Pierre emerges from it all with a radically different outlook and serene disposition. Tolstoy describes Pierre's new temperament as being one of complete inalienable freedom. By this he means that Pierre lives in an emotional and mental sphere independent of external circumstances. It's this Franklian Stoic approach, coupled with a secure belief in God, informed by sentiment rather than reason, that offers Pierre peace of mind. The fruits of this are that he is finally happy and unperturbed by all the problems that so plagued him previously. What is most important to note about Pierre here is that he achieves all this by means of detachment. Detachment from all his old yearnings and desires. All his life, Tolstoy writes of Pierre, he had looked over the heads of the men around him when he should have merely looked in front of him without straining his eyes. Searching for a beautiful wife brought him the misery of his marriage. Thirsting after experience drowned him in desolation. Craving after knowledge corrupted his character. So we see, perhaps, that one of Frankl's freedoms might be the decision to choose between attachment or detachment. Pierre, moving forward, must always recall that detachment pacifies the world, whereas attachment reels it roaring back in. Daily meditation. Wilt thou not cease to value many other things too? Then thou wilt neither be free, nor sufficient for thy own happiness, nor without passion. For of necessity thou must be envious, jealous, and suspicious of those who can take away those things, and plot against those who have that which is valued by thee. Of necessity a man must be altogether in a state of perturbation who wants any of these things. And besides, he must often find fault with the gods. But to reverence and honor thy own mind will make thee content with thyself, and in harmony with society, and in agreement with the gods, that is, praising all that they give and have ordered. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. All right, so that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 325 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that tomorrow we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 326 of War and Peace. I hope that you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.